Hello and welcome to the Unequal Exchange podcast. And today we're joined by Aryaman. Aryaman, please feel free to introduce yourself. We'll be discussing your article on semiconductors and tech transfer.
Hi, I'm Aryaman. I am a master's student of sociology at the Delhi School of Economics at the University of Delhi. I work with Collective, which is a student youth revolutionary organization in India. You can check their work out if you're interested in Indian politics and student movements in India. And I'm interested in world systems, unequal exchange, questions of imperialism, but I have a specific focus on the semi-periphery. I find the semi-periphery, being from India, to be, and of course with the current context of the world, to be my field of interest.
Great. Yeah, I think maybe first of all we can just introduce your article. Aryaman, how would you explain, what would you say is the goal of your article? Why did you write the article?
So, the reason that the article came out is a pretty interesting case. Even though the bulk of the article deals with China, the actual motivating factor for the paper came from India because, in the last 1 year or so, India, actually it's been a thing for nearly a decade where India has kind of pushed for, by India, the government of India has pushed for this idea of make in India and this idea of India has to start manufacturing and producing and has to, kind of move up in the world in that sense. And that's been the rhetoric from the government in some ways. And the actual motivating factor for the paper was in February of 2023, India puts out its annual budget, the government budget. And for the first time, India put out a very clearly section part that was for semiconductor production with the goal of producing semiconductors in India. The amount might not look a lot from the numbers that we see in the West, but 3,000 crore rupees, which is about you would say nearly 400 million USD, was set aside specifically for promoting manufacturing in India. And a year or so before, in 2022, there was a big, it was big national news in India. Vedanta, which is an Indian corporation, teamed up with Foxconn, which is of course one of the biggest in the world in contracting in these sections, put forward a $20 billion bid to the Indian government to open up, India's first proper manufacturing unit for semiconductors. And that was also big news because in India, there's this rhetoric that India has to move up in the sense, the usual India will be a superpower, India will achieve this and that. And this is considered a very core part of that, that we'll be the fourth, fifth country in the world to really enter into production of high-end semiconductors, something which is we want to be the envy of the world. And so in February, when this came out and the Indian government kind of restated their focus on this, and of course within the context of the last 5 years of the US-China's whole conflict on the question of semiconductors and sanctions and trade war and so on, I thought that it would be interesting to look at this question of how a specific industry, and an industry that is a highly high-tech, high profit, super important industry, how different countries try to enter it and what that has meant in the last decade. And in my research, I realized that it's not just the last decade thing, it's a question of many decades in the process of how an industry that has a very, very high barrier for entry does peripheralize. And that was kind of the motivating factor for it, to kind of look at the reality of how it has peripheralized, who has been allowed to peripheralize, how China and India, for very different reasons, by the way, have both had serious setbacks in trying to enter into the industry. So that was kind of the motivating factor to understand that process.
Yeah, I want to also pick up on that exact question of why you choose to use the world systems approach to understanding it. So you write specifically about the usefulness of taking an analysis of core and periphery and applying that to specific industries rather than just countries themselves. And the whole theme is around core monopolization of the semiconductor industry. But you also trace the process through which there is a possibility of peripheralizing these, whether in the production of them themselves, as you look at some of the companies like Fairchild that are the first on the frontier of offshoring, and more broadly discuss this big question of whether it would be possible for a semi-periphery to break into this core monopolized industry. Can you talk a little bit more about that that theme of how this one example is very much a great example of the broader process of neoliberal offshoring production.
Yeah, so I think the thing that makes world systems particularly more useful here is Wallerstein likes to use this word a lot. He uses quasi-monopoly a lot when he talks about what core processes actually entail. He says that those processes that are quasi-monopolized, that aren't open to free competition, that only some can do and not everyone can do, they tend to be what the core does, and and the periphery, on the other hand, it does that which everybody can do. And I mean, of course, I mean, an Emmanuel unequal exchange perspective is slightly different, but largely this does seem to be largely true if you look at the fact that agriculture, which is broadly something that has very low barrier to entry and everybody can do, is done largely by the peripheries, whereas the more cutting edge, the more monopolized sections are those you generally find in the core. The reason why this industry specifically is, and I make a comparison with automobiles too in an earlier in a full section, particularly highlights this core periphery separation and the monopolization that occurs is because when you trace the history of semiconductors, or earlier than that, you look at automobiles, these are industries that came about by innovations and developments of new products, essentially, right? The kind of thing that you would call the creative destruction, or so on in other terms. This new field that came up because of new technology, new innovation, new markets, and they essentially always emerged in the core. Automobiles developed in the core, semiconductors developed in the core, and when you look at the process of how these industries have developed as industries, and exactly how they spread to the rest of the world, you notice this very similar trend where, broadly speaking, the corporations of the core that formed the industry, that were the originators of the industry, continue to have a very dominating role much after the industry has peripheralized per se. And that peripheralization almost always entails more or less a very selective process of peripheralization, as in you don't peripheralize the entire industry. The parts that you offshore to the rest of the world are those selective parts that it makes sense to peripheralize. So in the context of semiconductors, in today's context, if we leave the history of how Taiwan and Korea and so on entered, the parts that are being done by the actual semi-periphery of today are those that are the sections that are essentially the afterthought, assembly and testing. And these are processes that aren't really the profitable or the big value or the important sections of the industry. The holding of IP rights, development of new machinery, all of this is still done by the United States, by Netherlands, by Japan, Europe, in general, right? You don't really see, for example, equipment is probably the best example in the semiconductors industry. Like equipment, the capacity to make anything in the semiconductors industry, even testing or any other step, that entire process of, or the machinery that entails that process is still, the rights to that and the development of that are still entirely held by the core. So when you look at it from a specific industry and you kind of map that specific industry's history and its geographical development from a core periphery lens, it kind of becomes, the arguments of world systems analysis or even unequal exchange or anything else really that speaks of this global differentiation becomes much more easier to grasp. So that's primarily why the world systems perspective is very useful in analyzing this.
Yeah, I think my question sort of follows on from what you were saying about the importance of the world systems approach. And in your work, you introduced this, or you use this term of the core process, where you have the two examples of the automobile industry, which used to be a core process, but no longer is a core process because various low-wage countries, Thailand, India, and other countries now specialize in this sector, where before it was monopolized by the high-wage countries. And then you also have the semiconductor industry, which is, you sort of claim that it's the paradigmatic core process in today's world, monopolized by the high-wage countries. And the term core process it's a very important term in Wallerstein and world systems analysis, but it's also been subject to, at least it's been subject to some criticism as well. The way that Wallerstein uses it, for instance, because Wallerstein has a tendency often to not maybe satisfactorily define his terms, although he gives very interesting sort of historical analyses, but his actual conceptual definitions are less satisfying than, say, Emmanuel's. But I wanted your take, because the term core process fascinates me as well, and it's extremely an important term, I'd say as well. But how would you explain a core process? And most importantly, my question is, how does specialization in a core process relate to the maintenance of high wages throughout a given society? What is the relation between this? That's my big question.
Right. So
high wages and the core process. Yes.
Right. So in the comparison between semiconductors and automobiles, there is one thing that is important to state, and I make the argument in the paper too. It's true that the majority of the production process in the automobiles industry has shifted to much of the semi-periphery. Almost entirely done by the semi-periphery. China, India, Thailand, examples go on, right? But it's important to remember that largest players and the largest corporations are still core corporations in terms of market reach, in terms of income, in terms of size. It's all, the industry is still fundamentally monopolized by the core. And if you look at the separation of the industry in terms of, again, in value-added processes and other things, it's still hugely core biased. And I make that argument in the paper too, in the sense that, well, it's true that, the actual production of vehicles happens in the semi-periphery. The largest amount of production is still largely controlled by the core and with the dictats of the core, which isn't true in the semiconductors industry as of now, in the sense that it is wholly core monopolized from, 95% of the processes occur in the core, which is an important difference. Talking about wage differentiation and how that plays into this, well, of course, the logic of offshoring, of neoliberal offshoring in general has to do, of course, with wage differentiation and taking from Emmanuel's other work on technology. No matter if we are Marxists or we are critical of capitalism and so on, we have to understand the rationale of how corporations work and the draw of profit. And fundamentally, when Emmanuel makes the argument for technology transfers, in a way, he's arguing that the interstate system is a regulatory factor for capitalism, but capitalism doesn't have to follow that rule. When China, not China today, but China earlier invited the USSR for tech transfers, and then you have various other examples of the USSR itself inviting tech transfers. All of these things are, the interstate system is a regulatory system. It doesn't, it can't prevent processes of peripheralization necessarily. And that's, the later argument in the paper kind of deals with that question of how the interstate system, in today's world, the core is trying extremely hard. It's going out of its way to restrict the free market drastically to prevent peripheralization. But coming back to wage differentiation, of course, the question of wage differentiation is one that is slightly related but slightly unrelated in the sense because, well, it's absolutely true that, for example, the same labor done by, say, the Ford factory workers in Detroit versus the Ford factory workers in the semi-periphery, it's the same labor, but of course they're paid a much, much, much lower wage. And the history of that and the question of that is, of course, a whole other topic of the historical differentiation between the first world and the third world and so on. But primarily what this means is that ideally, every industry would, in some form or the other, when of course, and that's again a question of the organic composition of capital and other such things, but when labor costs, of course, in the third world are much lower than the first world, then corporations, of course, try their best to leave. And in a sense, when I talk about how the United States has given this $200 billion subsidy to chip corporations to come back to produce in the United States, that is an attempt in some sense for the United States to pay for the higher wages of American workers. Because you take the example of TSMC. TSMC is, I think currently the plan is en route to open their factory in the United States after the CHIPS Act was passed by the United States government. And of course, the only reason that TSMC is able to come to the United States and run a factory there is because the United States is providing such a huge amount of subsidies to cover the increased cost of production. And that increased cost of production, of course, is because of the higher wages of workers in the United States as compared to even Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, is substantially higher wages than an India or a China. So, the relation here is a complex one where the state has to step in because, of course, politically it's impossible for the United States to reduce workers' wages to make the United States competitive to produce chips. Not just, right now the United States is designing chips, and Apple designs chips and all these companies design chips, but the actual manufacturing process is so is a cost that no company would like to willingly bear in the United States, when Taiwan, which is doing it for much cheaper, has a history of high efficiency in it as well today. So it's an interesting situation today, because and I mean, let's see in the next few years how the CHIPS Act really fares out, because I mean, currently the United States' incentives are the sole reason that TSMC and others are able to come in and produce in the United States. And I mean, for the United States to continue manufacturing chips, if it wants to continue to develop chips domestically in that sense, would require hundreds and billions of dollars of subsidies year after year after year to make up for the excess cost of production in the United States because of those high wages. I hope I dealt with the question.
Is it right if I just... Sorry, Joseph. I know we
no, of course. Go for it.
If I just continue with that sort of question, edit out all my arms and ahs. But so with the relation between core processes and high wages, the way that I've been thinking about it recently, mainly just through Emmanuel's work, is that these core processes, this is a way to prevent the high wages, the growing wages. Historically, today maybe they're not growing so much, but historically especially, to prevent these high wages from coming into competition with low wages of low wage countries. And by specializing in these sectors which have these huge technological and skill barriers, which you described very well with regard to the semiconductor industry, and also just the huge entry costs as well for the fixed capital investments and so on. By specializing in these sorts of industries, the high wages don't have any competition from low-wage countries, where otherwise low-wage countries would try and compete with them and so on. So it's the importance of having a sector all to themselves. And Emmanuel even writes that it doesn't matter in terms of capital intensity, although this is one factor leading to sort of an ideal sector for high wages. He says that if a high-wage country specializes in tulips and low-wage countries don't specialize in this, that's just as fine for them. So I was wondering if you would agree that there's this importance for the high-wage countries to have certain sectors where low-wage countries can compete with them. Because you say that the core, almost by necessity, must seek to protect these technologies from reaching the periphery. And I'm just interested in the rationale for this, because nowadays, there's the whole topic of semiconductors. It's so popular, and always see it in various news, analytic resources, and so on, mainstream. Usually there's an emphasis on the military technological application, which you also say that this is the way that the Biden regime sort of justifies it in terms of legislative acts and so on. But I feel like, and sometimes often Marxist writers, they don't mainly focus on this or sort of these technological aspects. I was wondering the broader social necessity for this. And I was wondering if you'd agree with this.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, we talk about Emmanuel's conception. I think countries like Australia or New Zealand are, good examples of countries that historically did not necessarily participate in the production of some cutting edge or something that no other country could do, and they were mostly primary goods were what they were exporting with the rest of the world and producing. Of course, then it becomes a tricky question then to talk about this idea of whether it is absolutely necessary for the core to. I mean, the high wages are in some ways the precursor to a lot of processes. It's not necessarily true that you need to have high technology to then have high wages. It's often that high wages require the protection of things that are restrictive to enter. I agree broadly that yes, it's true in the sense that historically, you take the example of the United Kingdom, the UK during the colonial era, then they were able to strengthen their hegemonical position in the world system, of course, through their monopoly on the early industrial process, textiles and other things that nobody else could produce, right? Historically, we see this trend generally where even during the early ages of the exploitation of colonialism, you had traders who were able to trade in things that nobody else could trade in markets. So, of course, the quasi-monopoly is super important in terms of holding for the core something that the others can't really access. And broadly speaking, I mean, I would agree that the argument I make in the paper, of course, is saying that definitionally, you would expect that the core would never want technology to leave, right? Something that they can do that nobody else can do. And I mean, historically, we have seen that play out in various cases, in various situations. And semiconductors is one of those cases in a sense, because, of course, the justification is national interest in military and this idea of we can't let the enemy get this into their hands and so on. But of course, then in reality, the realization is that the semiconductors is an industry that is super, super important economically and not just militarily. And economic control in those sense and ensuring that only you have the say in its production and its output is basically super important for the core, because that's what keeps the hegemony in some sense alive. And I'm not trying to say that semiconductors are necessarily of course, now it is one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, commodity in the world today. But even broadly in other industries that might be smaller in scope, the fact that there's nobody else in the world who can fill in that niche, and that the entry into that is so impossible for the rest of the world, protects the interests of the core, and not just the core bourgeoisie or the core state, but it's also important to, of course, the working class and the core, who have trained up those skills and who have, I mean, historically there were points where specialization and skill in various sectors were essentially only available in the core. And Emmanuel's work on technology again kind of deals with that question of how do you get people to be trained in places that don't have the technology. And I mean, of course, the monopolization of technology is itself linked to that idea, where I mean, if you think about let's just say science, or you think of just in the realm of science, in like 60 years ago, 70 years ago, outside of the core, there was no real development or laboratories or innovation that was possible, because the core essentially had that super strong monopoly on technological innovation. And even various other sectors, look at finance or IT or so on and so forth, then the core does try its best to ensure that as little people as possible can compete with them. And of course, that's to prevent, I mean, that is again related to the idea of prevention of the equilibrium of wages that the core tries, because after all, the core makes up 15% of the population, right? So it does have to, in some sense, ensure something is only open to 15% of the population and not a hypothetical 60, 70, 100.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the trend of this discussion. I loved how you began the analysis of the history of the semiconductor industry through its role in military production stemming out of World War II. And with the tech transfer in particular, it almost reminded me of historically the issues in the early Industrial Revolution or in mercantilism, when trade and industrial espionage were such a big factor, and Britain would heavily punish anyone who attempted to move cotton manufacturing technology to the United States, for example. And it's very interesting how you point out that the U.S. initially shared the tech with Japan, and then Japan shared it with South Korea. I love that whole analysis of how Japan rose using semiconductors and then offshored it to South Korea, and it had its development. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit about why, in your analysis, the U.S. would not allow that tech transfer with say China, but would allow it and allow for some movement, as you said, I forget Wallerstein's exact term, but promotion by invitation, as you say, for its military allies.
So, I mean, yeah, you gave a really good example. The industrial revolution is a very apt comparison, because almost all of the processes that we see occurring in these terms today has in some sense a comparison with the early industrial revolution, because the early industrial revolution was also marked by this idea of this new method and this new technology and this new technique that was essentially out of the hands of the others. So yeah, I think that's a good comparison. As for the history of the United States, well, I mean, it's not that difficult to figure that out historically. I mean, the role of the United States in East Asia after World War II has a very close link to anti-communism and its whole understanding of fostering that anti-communist set of the bulwark of nations in East Asia against this imagined tide of the USSR and China. And of course, that has its history in the United States going back to the post-war occupation, and similarly even in Korea and other places where the United States, as a political measure, basically decided to foster these economies and these countries, to protect them and to develop them within its wing, with this understanding that they'll be loyal to the United States when push comes to shove, and that they want to be economically weak and therefore prone to a communist uprising. That's broadly, the historical rationale behind the United States' action there. Why the United States is, of course, uneager to share this technology with the rest of the world, and I'm talking about even countries that are not necessarily opposed to the United States' interest, in countries like India or others who, as I highlight in my paper, have been struggling to get access to this technology, is because fundamentally it's, there's two reasons actually. Fundamentally, with the case with China, it's very obvious, of course, because China is in the United States is in eyes, of course, its main rival to being the sole hegemon of the capitalist world system. In the case of India and other countries, fundamentally the rationale here is that there's no requirement. In some sense, in today's context especially, the United States is even eager to move production out of its own allies and into its own borders. So for reasons that again has to do with the geopolitics more than anything economical. And I've showcased in the paper and in the interview just now too. It's highly uneconomical for the United States to want to decouple in some ways and move everything back to the United States, but it believes that this is the sensible thing to do from a geopolitical perspective. But yeah, it is not necessarily out of US's will that it created, and I highlight that in the paper as well, when the United States began to corporations in the United States, with the help of the United States government, brokered really good deals with Taiwan and Japan and the corporations in Taiwan and Japan. It wasn't in their imagination that these countries would one day be able to compete with the United States. In their imagination, they were doing this to keep their allies doing the jobs that they didn't want to do. I highlight that with Taiwan as the example, where Fairchild kind of opens up the first assembly unit in Taiwan because it wasn't affordable to have American workers do that anymore. And so they began that with the logic that we'll be offshoring the parts that Americans don't want to do to this cheap East Asian labor. And the result, of course, was that because these countries took that technology and that opportunity and kind of and with Taiwan especially, it's probably the best example because in a sense, Taiwan's entire economy is centered around the semiconductors and the technology industry. It's also important to understand that the United States did not do this out of some benevolence, even to its own allies. It was very clearly doing this with self-interest in mind. And the corporations that licensed their technology to Japanese firms and to other firms. You see that in the 80s when Japan starts to compete with the United States, they launch a heavy slew of lawsuits against them, which is really interesting because when these firms were not competing with them and not bothering their interests and their share in the market, there was no issue. But of course, when Japanese firms began to compete, it became an important issue, and in some sense, there's a repeat of that today with Taiwan, where because Taiwan is so much has eclipsed the United States in that sense in terms of production, then in a sense, the United States has a problem with that. It wants to move that back into its own control. So it's even with its own allies, the technology transfers were not benevolent. They were with a very clear intention. Of course, then that didn't end up playing out the way that the United States and its corporations intended. And that's where, you have the whole US-Japan conflict in the 80s, trade conflict, and how that's linked to further tech transfers out to Korea and others.
Yeah, and in a certain sense, US trade and investment in China to begin with was sort of seen as something that wouldn't lead to what it led to today. And it's also in the context of the Sino-Soviet split and the US trying to also these geopolitical imperatives and so on. And I also just wanted to say that an amazing book that I've read recently, a fairly new book, is Jim Glassman's book about Drums of War, Drums of Development, which is about East and Southeast Asian industrialization. A really incredible book. It doesn't really have a Machiavellian perspective, although it more focuses on the geopolitical, geoeconomic aspect of how exactly this invitation by promotion work. And he places more emphasis as well, not emphasis, but he just investigates this aspect of it all, of the military-industrial contracts for Japan during the Korean War and also for the Republic of Korea during the Vietnamese War, which is something that the authors that you cite, Castley and Chiba, they don't really go into so much, although they're really good on investigating the way that selective U.S. trade opening with Korea was really crucial for its industrialization. And what I found really interesting as well in Glassman's work is that he looks into, obviously there's the aspect of the US wanting to make Republic of Korea into this showpiece for the free world and so on and so on, but also the fact that it was Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War, its willingness to involve itself in the Vietnam War. There was this really huge condition for the US granting it these industrial kickbacks in the Brown Memorandum, as it was known, that the U.S. didn't grant to its other allies, to Philippines and to Thailand and so on, which were just as much Cold War allies, but they weren't given this preferential treatment because their elite wasn't willing to go with the U.S. as far as it did in the Vietnam War. And then also another fascinating thing about this book is that it goes into how, like you were saying, the fact that the U.S. is generally not willing to allow its allies to industrially develop much at all. And when there was the Park Chung-hee coup in Korea, lots of the U.S. sort of national security and top elite were quite worried about it. They were worried about a sort of anti-market sort of tendencies, and there were various attempts to stop him, and some of them, they did actually stop some of his different policies, the monetary reform and so on. Anyway, that's just a really interesting. One thing that I sometimes wonder, this is not really a question that's necessary to answer, because I'm not really sure to what extent, but is the extent to which Emmanuel's work doesn't take into account enough these interstate relations, I suppose, and these broader, I guess. I'm not sure if that's his work needs to address that, and whether his work comes into any contradiction with a look at that. But that's one thing that I sometimes wonder. But anyway, this is all leading to my question, which is I really appreciate your work for the attempt to give an answer to the limits of promotion by invitation, because often, especially in these, I guess, semi-client or semi-client regimes in a third world, there's this real hope, this utopia that we'll become just like South Korea. In Ukraine, this is where I lived for a while. This was a very common thing, which is why I got interested in this topic. I'm sure that in India as well, among certain circles, there's also this idea that, if we have to stay on the good side of the US and we'll become as rich as Korea and so on. Although Korea is not a very nice place to live, from what people I know from Korea tell me. But anyway, I was wondering if you could give an outline of how you see the limits to invitation by promotion. Why can't all countries become like South Korea?
So before that, you said a really interesting thing about kind of the limitations of Emmanuel's work, and or rather the incapacity to deal with some questions. I think fundamentally, one of the things my paper is trying to saliently argue when it uses Emmanuel's work is that Emmanuel's work is from the broadest logic on technology transfer specifically. His work on the broadest sense is absolutely right. I mean, if even the poorest of poor nations does the right national policies and does the right things to kind of invite foreign capital, ideally you should see that happen. And I mean, from a ideal picture of capitalism, that is how it should work. But of course, kind of the broader argument my paper is making is that when India and China have tried their hardest to do what Emmanuel would have, if Emmanuel was to comment on this, might have said that, yeah, they should do this if they want to gain access to technologies that they don't have. That in reality hasn't panned out. And of course, that puts to the point that this idea of all of the neoliberal model in that sense, which imagines this idea of if everyone plays by these rules, that things will play out. And this, I'm not trying to claim that Emmanuel was a neoliberal, not at all, but this idea of the corporation, of the multinational corporation as a vehicle that's entirely detached from the interstate system and the states is something that doesn't really exist. I take the case again of in semiconductors, you see in support of Emmanuel's perspective, you see IBM, which was once one of the biggest partners of the United States government, was happy to when it saw an opportunity to be for profit and for the right situation in China, it was very happy to transfer technology and license things over. But of course, when the state steps in and kind of creates hurdles, of course, that in some sense prevent you from doing anything, then that's a very real part of capitalism too, and of how core peripheral relations continue. Ideally, capitalism might, or the laws of capitalism might create situations that are in very many ways restricted by the interstate system. About promotion by invitation, one of the fundamental things I argue is that even if, let's imagine that China and India were not necessarily opposed to the United States, to the current hegemonical arrangement of the world, there is no possibility for them to see this to a similar rise that Korea or Japan or anybody else had in the 20th century. And one of the reasons I give for that is that if you look at the population of all these of the Asian tigers and the others who are considered to be the gold standards of those countries that saw dramatic improvements in their conditions after the neoliberal era, you'll notice that their populations are tiny compared to the populations of countries like India or China, or even countries like, let's go, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria. All of the countries that today are the major semi-peripheral countries of the world in the global south, their populations are huge. Hundreds of millions at the least, and billions in the case of India and China, right? So, one of the things that Minky Lee writes about in his book on China, he talks about how when China entered the world system, which was not formally entered capitalism proper and opened up itself to the world economy, it's around the same time that countries like Korea and others were really able to move up in the world, had saw dramatic increases in domestic wages and income. And he talks about how this was able to be captured really easily by the sudden entry of hundreds of millions of Chinese low-wage laborers who were able to make up for that dramatic increase in consumption and wages for some part of the world. And of course, the difference here is in terms of numbers. You have dozens of millions of people enter the core, whereas you have hundreds and hundreds, billions of people in the periphery to capture that. But if those billions of people in the periphery, and you take the cases of India and China, were to start consuming and earning incomes even comparable to Taiwan, I'm not talking about the richest countries in the core, fundamentally that is unsustainable in the world system. Where is that surplus going to come from? Definitely not from the pockets of the actual capitalist class. It has to come from the exploitation of some periphery somewhere which has dramatically low wages that produce goods for the consumption of those with higher wages. And of course, if you have 3 billion people enter from India and China, for example, into core levels of consumption, then that's fundamentally unsustainable ecologically and economically, because there just isn't enough people to exploit further at that point. So, realistically speaking, promotion by invitation, it's still possible today, but you have to have very special criteria. You have to be a country of specific size or specific requirement of specific use. The semi-peripheries of the world don't really fit into that picture at all. None of them. I give the case, and I have an upcoming paper talking about this. I talk about how, and you talked about how in India there might be some people who clamor for a pro-United States perspective. Interestingly enough, after India liberalized in 1991, you do see the rise of this section at the top 5-10% of the income bracket that actually earns huge wages. Wages that are much closer to the core than the rest of the country. And this is a phenomenon that occurs in China too, where you have this top percentage who capture really high wages, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 easily as their annual income in that top sections, which puts them, of course, much closer to their relatives, their equivalents in the first world. And in the case of India, for example, you have the average wage being I know it in rupees and dollars. It's nothing. It's less than a few $1,000s a year, and you have top section, which includes those who benefited from this opening up of India, which includes IT workers, and you have business professionals. They earn $50,000 pretty easily, which makes them a very privileged section in India. And largely, the reality of modern capitalism is exactly that you have. In the semi-peripheries and in the countries that have hundreds of millions of people, you have just a handful of millions of people who actually can gain dramatically higher wages, who can consume at levels not too dissimilar from the core. And that is kind of the fundamental limitation of the promotion by invitation or any other thing that, at maximum, you will have a few people in your country who will be able to consume like the core, or who will have wages like the core. But for the vast majority of the country and for the national economy, and in the broader characteristics of the country, you can't really. There's really no scope for significant economic mobility. It's only open for the very small minority.
I want to ask about your analysis with the manual as well, to go further into that on tech transfer. You have a quote where you say that summarizing the manual's analysis as capital induced to act against the quote national interest in the pursuit of profit, and you even have a footnote that discusses how a manual doesn't even necessarily differentiate between foreign and national capital. Like, that's not a differentiation he considers. I'm curious, with this analysis that you're mapping on the particular scale of semiconductors, right? When you look at how you talked about how fabless manufacturing went from being something of a taboo within the semiconductor industry, but all of a sudden by the 2000s, Apple, Nvidia, they had become like, they had risen to prominence on the back of fabless manufacturing. With Emmanuel's central contradiction of capital moving against the so-called national interest, as we're moving out of, and I think this is part of your analysis as well, out of the stage of neoliberal globalization and possibly back towards an interstate conflict period, how do you see the particularities of semiconductor production? Do you think people will retreat, or companies will retreat back from fabless manufacturing, will fight to maintain their production at the global value chain level? What do you think the companies themselves will do as the U.S. seeks to act on its national interest?
So there's a few different things to address here. So first, the point of fabless, the development of fabless manufacturing itself is related to the monopolization of certain parts. So, I mean, if you think about our why Taiwan, for example, specifically Taiwan became so successful and today is, I mean, the world's single largest player in terms of high-tech production, is specifically because all of the sections that have very strong IP rights and property rights and protections from that side were already all largely monopolized by the core. And the core historically, and I mean, as is generally the case, and Emmanuel talks about this in his technology work, R&D work and research work has a history there. For example, if India today opens up labs to try to attempt to say push for the next cutting edge type of technology, it has to essentially make up for like a century of work that has occurred in other places. And so fundamentally the core, when we talk about this period of even the 80s, 90s, when for example, Taiwan, Korea and others had by this time had a suitably skilled workforce, with engineering degrees and all this training, who were very capable to carry out, manufacturing or any part of the semiconductors industry, the gap essentially became that R&D and core development and development of core IP and other parts of what's really important, the designing stage of semiconductors, had too strong a presence in the core, where essentially for the longest period of time, there was nowhere else in the world that there was any development in that sector happening. And the reason that fabless manufacturing was able to rise up is because fundamentally the only thing that is one needs to really hold in any industry today, especially to make the real profits, is to be the holder of rights, the holder of that, those who can license. And I mean, the automobile is another great example, because even though the production of automobiles is happening in the rest of the world, all the rights and all the patents and all the IP rights and the new machinery, all of that is still developed in the core, by the core, and licensed out by the core to clients in the semi-periphery or periphery. And that is one important thing to remember about the kind of the hierarchy of the process of semiconductor production, because designing is still by far the most important. And the largest companies are still the ones who don't do any manufacturing but just hold on to design, and that's again Apple, Nvidia, AMD, all of the big players. Their essential part is in R&D and IP rights and other things of that sort. Coming to the question of today and what that seems like, people in the industry, and the one good thing about studying semiconductors is that people in the industry put out really detailed reports. You can find information which is extremely, extremely detailed. And I make this conclusion in towards the end of the text. it's pretty obvious that in reality, a complete decoupling of the industry is not really possible. I mean, even the basic process of asking some sections to open up factories in the core, which is what the United States is doing, is costing so much. Fundamentally, it's not really a feasible thing in the long term. And what to me seems to be the more feasible outcome here is that because of this fear of, and of course, this national interest and all of these things are, of course, the dominating factor in the discourse and the conversation in government and other places too. Fundamentally, what seems to be the most likely outcome is that the core basically ensures that nobody outside of those who are currently in the industry get realistic access to the industry. That's fundamentally what the goal is here. And what's interesting about this is that, funnily enough, when I first submitted this paper for publication, a lot of the things I talked about hadn't yet happened, and I luckily got a chance to revise them and added a lot of events that have happened very recently, including I talked about these upcoming rules and regulations. They still aren't in place. But for example, the United States is putting forward rules that mean that any machinery that has any components ever built and designed in the United States can no longer be sold internationally without consent from the United States, right? So fundamentally, that means that, for example, even if one of the other core states decided or found a deal to trade with China or with anybody else without the permission of the United States is final say, or else you face sanctions, right? And fundamentally, what the United States is trying to do is it understands that realistically speaking, how the industry is already now peripheralized to some extent. It can't really do too much to undo that. I mean, it's trying through things like the CHIPS Act and other things. But fundamentally, its primary goal seems to be to prevent anybody else from entering it now. And it's doing that through all these protections. And it's not just China, of course, because China is, of course, the largest opponent to the United States. But the case of India is especially interesting because India failed entirely to gain a tech partner for a really big project, and interestingly enough, that project is 10 years outdated compared to what TSMC is doing. So it's not even like India is trying to enter the direct cutting edge. Even trying to enter what was a 10-year-old version of the industry, it fails to gain support from the core because the industry is now kind of in this like closed off mode where it really is. The states and the governments are kind of very serious about ensuring that there is no peripheralization of this. So I think that's more likely to be the future of the industry, where it's essentially at its limit in terms of its peripheralization, and any further peripheralization will at most be for testing and packaging, not really for production or design.
My next question was to do with your, I suppose, vision for the future in a more, say, maybe hopeful or aggressive sense, because you do mention the likelihood of defining wars, so which I think we can definitely see up on the horizon. But you also do mention towards the beginning the attempt by the Chinese government during its less market-oriented phase of development in the 50s or 60s and 70s to create its own domestic semiconductor industry. Obviously, this was much less developed than what was happening in the core, but it still was perhaps definitely more developed than other comparable peripheral countries over the time. And then once China opened up in terms of trade to the capitalist world, this nascent semiconductor industry disappeared under competition, and now it's returned. But you do make this emphasis that China, which I think could definitely be said to be the most relatively successful, let's say, capitalist developmentalist state currently in existence, maybe, currently in existence for sure, it still isn't able to come really close to the technological level of the core. And you talk about various difficulties of China in this respect, despite huge steps forward and relative success. It's still in the generational gap you talk about. And I was wondering, what do you think if there were? I think we can, if we just exclude the sort of world revolution type of thing, which we can sort of agree historically doesn't really have any real bearing. But if there was something similar, let's say, to the 20th century, where certain parts of the world undergo some kind of revolutionary progressive transformation, but there's still, the core continues to exist, and these sections take place in relatively poor countries and so on. What do you think would be the progressive step to be taken with regards to these core processes and so on? Because I guess my question is, how would it really differ from what China is doing at the moment? I guess that's my sort of question.
So fundamentally, the example of China's semiconductor industry prior to the Deng reform period and so on, it was a very fledgling industry. It didn't even as early as back then semiconductors globally were quite fledgling in the 60s and so on. But China essentially till today, really, it's not really that different today. Fundamentally, has never been able to give up its dependency on imports from the core for semiconductors, and that's something that, despite all efforts, and that's one of the things I can try to argue that with very conscious efforts from the 2000s onwards, has fundamentally failed in various regards to give up that dependency to the core in that sense. On the question of developing one's own technology or that being something that's possible, of course, in capitalism specifically, practically every innovation happens at the top, and that's of course because of the immense cost of R&D and the fact that only the core has enough capacity to invest into R&D and have all these researchers and all these labs and equipment that nobody else has, and fundamentally then that's one of the things about capitalism. And Emmanuel is pretty conscious about that when he writes in about technology transfer, that an indigenous development of technology that can catch up with the core is more or less an impossibility. It's not really ever likely possible, and I make that same point in my paper where unless there's some kind of extreme luck or something of that sort, or some world affecting crises and collapses or something of that sort, there is really no likelihood that technology indigenously developed without interaction with the rest of the world can develop. Now, talking about an ideal future and what that should entail, or what a non-capitalist alternative to this or any of these things it would be, that becomes a tricky question, of course, because there's, when we look at the history of the Soviet Union and of Maoist China, Emmanuel talks about it a lot in his textbook about how he quotes a lot from Mao himself, where Mao repeatedly talks about how the USSR had a significant role in transferring technology and bringing over skilled technicians, and all of these things that are super important for China itself to get past that extreme poverty agricultural base into having some kind of manufacturing and some kind of progression. And that's of course important for the base that was later in a sense exploited by global capital. And even the case of Japan and Korea is not that different, where of course Korea did really know R&D of its own and was able to almost entirely get technology from the outside, and then with that do what it could. And Emmanuel, in a sense, seems to agree with this perspective that, of course, for people who critics of Emmanuel would love to call him some kind of neoliberal or some kind of capitalist, but it's obviously not true. He is also fundamentally grasping with the same question that, as a Marxist and one who imagines a world that is free of capitalist relations, realistically speaking, how does the third world or how does anybody else access technology? And in that sense, Emmanuel broadly, he's very clearly talking about the real historical cases of Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam or Mao Zedong's China, and he's trying to understand what they had to do and what will be required. And fundamentally, it seems to me that within the capitalist system, there is no other option but, in some sense, to lure in technology in one way or the other, and that has to happen through almost entirely through luring in MNCs, because, like Emmanuel argues, they are the primary convection of technology. On China today, then of course, China is doing what it has to do to gain technology and to gain anything really to improve its condition in the modern world today. And of course, I'm as critical of China as I'm of India or as I am of any other semi-peripheral state, and of course for their excesses in various things. But within the logic of capitalism, there's really no other option. That's one thing that is you have to state. Like, an imagination of an indigenous development doesn't exist. If we are to talk about some socialist imagination of this question, then it becomes again a tricky question, because I think Emmanuel's written, I don't remember where he wrote about this. Was it in the tech book? I might be wrong, but he talks about how it would have to essentially be a controlled invitation of technology, where you have to be, where if you are a country that is serious, or a nation that or anything serious about developing socialism or moving away from capitalist relations, you still will have to, in some way or the other, invite in the technology that puts you at a disadvantage. And whether will that require the state to control it? Will that require something else that is many people do argue that China is doing that today. And of course, I mean, the prominent position of Marxists who support China today, they do say that China is doing what it has to do, and then it can look at socialism. Of course, to me, that, I mean, if you're asking me personally, then I'm not so convinced that China or any other state today is looking towards a socialist future. That's a separate question entirely. Whether China has legitimately a vision towards a socialist future is a separate question that, we have no, I can't really answer that. It would be good if China has that 2050 socialist vision. But yeah, I do think that fundamentally the technology question is one that Marxists do avoid. And even when you consider the history of the USSR and the history of Maoist China, then the question of how they acquire technology is a very important one. And that's one that you have to contend with, because, yes, the joint dictatorship of the proletariat of oppressed nations and all of these things ideally would be amazing, but even if all the poorest countries in the world got together, they would still be at a technological deficiency and with incapacity to produce what the core is producing. And of course, the core is not going socialist, right? It's not. We don't have that hope of Marx's era where England will be socialist and then will help the rest of the world out. That seems incredibly unlikely. So I will say that it is a question that's Emmanuel does grapple with it himself, that a socialist organization or socialist government or anything of that sort will have to be pretty careful in controlling foreign imports, and will have to lure them in, but in some sense ensure that it's still under the control of a socialist government and other things of that sort. I don't remember where he wrote it. It might have been the tech book.
Peter, do you have any more questions?
No, really. I think I asked basically everything. There's lots of really interesting stuff in this article. I really liked how you just sort of clearly went through the different statistics about the semiconductor. The semiconductor situation. One thing that I found really, I don't really know if we need to, I don't really have that many more questions. I'm fine to chat for a little bit more if that's okay with you, Aryaman. Joseph, I'm going to go to sleep pretty soon. But one thing that I also liked was this note about Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and the role of the Second World War in terms of weakening the Americans in the automobile industry. It's kind of a thing that lots of dependency theorists, generally economic historians, talk about with Latin America as well during World War II. I think in other parts, but especially with Latin America. Gunther Frank always kind of wrote about this with World War II and World War I, with these kind of brief periods of Latin American economic industrialization, because they just didn't have competition from the First World. And it's interesting the importance of these, sort of historical importance of these sort of fascist regimes, in Japan and in Germany, in terms of creating this, I guess, basic industrialization. I'm not creating it in terms of, but playing a very important role. It's really fascinating. Something else. And I think it's really great that you wrote this article, because so often people still kind of have this idea that, world system theory is dead because of South Korea and stuff. And I think that, world system theory is really broad and includes a bunch of things, but I really think that, Emmanuel's work really allows us to understand the conditions of possibility for this, most importantly, the limits of this, and instead of, with most, obviously, liberal theory thinks there's no limits to this. But then lots of Marxist work, they don't really explain, the objective limits of this. And I feel like only Emmanuel can actually give a basis for that.
you brought up that thing about the wars. Even outside of the context of in general, the possibilities for economic development and other things that those moments offer, I think it is pretty interesting that, just how much of anti-systemic possibilities emerged out of these crisis situations. And thinking about it today in the sense, there's a lot of discourse on wars and multipolarity and all of these different questions that come up today. I think fundamentally there is something that I think is important to look at, is that the moments of crisis do allow for anti-systemic creation, and of course the fascist movements in some sense were of course anti-systemic, and then of course World War I and its relation to the Russian Revolution, and World War II to the Chinese Revolution. Fundamentally, it's only in moments of that, like that, where for whatever reason the regular working of the world system and the interstate relations within it are kind of frozen or put into crisis, that you really see possibilities for drastic change. And not to promote some accelerationist vision of what has to be done, but realistically speaking, everybody's aware of the fact that the hegemony of the United States, what it was in the 60s and 70s, where minimum wage earners earned 100 times the wage of somebody else, and all of these things that existed that at its peak, the US's hegemony, and of course in decline today. And I think that fundamentally for people who are anti-imperialist and for people who have a Marxist persuasion, then I do think that the moments of crisis are the ones where the most where we have to be opportune in that sense. So I think that's definitely a really true point. That's
one thing that I was also wondering about is this kind of, this is, I don't know enough about all these different things to say, but there's kind of this idea that I sometimes see, and it sounds kind of cool to me, but that China will invade, do a special military operation against Taiwan to take the factory, right? And then if they take the factory, then China now has global economic domination. It's really cool, and it sounds awesome, man, they should just do it. They should do it tomorrow. But is that actually true, or the impression that I kind of get from the article is that not really, because it's kind of it's not actually doing the design there, right? They'll take it, but it's kind of the same situation as now. And also, wouldn't if they don't have the design, because obviously the US would just cut off the design stuff to China at that point, and it's all being designed in Silicon Valley. It would help them, I'm sure, because there are all these sort of different machines that aren't been getting to them otherwise. But it wouldn't be this kind of giant game changer, right?
It's important to remember that TSMC, which is the biggest producer, is it entirely works on contracts when Apple and AMD and Nvidia and all these guys kind of come and say, hey, we need here's the model, here's the specifications, we need 1 billion unit of this by this. It's that's how it works, So I guess in a sense that even before you get to China, that kind of explains that Taiwan itself is in that sense, of course, is a client state off the core in that sense, where its production is dependent on the requirements of the corporations that demand this of TSMC. And if China does invade and take over TSMC's factory and all these things that I know that Americans love to panic over. The realistic outcome there is just that. Well, if that does happen, then I'm pretty sure that Apple and AMD and others are not going to be giving China that contract anymore, right? So, it's not. I don't think that's going to. Specifically with the example of semiconductors itself is going to somehow, turn China's fortunes from being a huge net importer into suddenly being, the champion of the industry. That's not possible. And again, the fundamental point of my paper really is that. At the end of the day, this in the semi-periphery, and of course, me living in India, this is a rhetoric you see all the time, that if you follow this and this step, then like we said earlier, if you do this and this, then we will one day we will be like South Korea, we will be like the US, we will compete with them. And I think the fundamental, the larger argument of my paper where I take, semiconductors really is just an example here, is that. Not only is it something that's in direct contention with the interests of the current core, but it's just ecologically and economically is not feasible. that is the sobering reality of the matter. I mean, no matter how much we would like India or China or any other of semi-peripheral country to replay or to move up in the world, it just can't. And that's, I mean, I think that is something, I mean, for people who have this hope of this multipolarity or this hope of, I don't know, India or China or some other country will emerge as the winner of the 21st century or any other perspective of that sort. I think the sobering realization has to occur that just isn't fundamentally possible, and not within the way that capitalism works today. And I mean, and I make this argument, which is that even if the entirety of the core became semi-peripheral and the semi-periphery entered into the core, it still wouldn't work because the semi-peripheral population is just too large. India and China, their populations are unbelievably huge. I mean, the entirety of the core today is 16-17% of the population at best, and India and China themselves are 20% each. So I think fundamentally the question that has to be grappled with today is that mobility within the world system is not really itself an outcome or an out that's going to liberate people. There are very clear hard limits for it, and those hard limits are I mean, essentially we are very close to approaching them. And I'm not even talking about from an ecological perspective, where ecologically speaking, the current arrangement of the world already is, we are way past the hard limit ecologically. But even on a pure economic basis, where this idea of everyone's wages can keep rising, and if at one point everyone will be rich, I mean, of course that's an impossibility. And so and in some way this is a sobering realization for people who do cheer for this imagination of a multipolar world that is somehow gonna be as wealthy and as luxurious as the current core lives or the current core setup. That just isn't possible. And I think that is something very concrete, and especially in terms of the ecological crises we see today, that becomes ever more important. And the unfortunate thing is, and I'm saying this as my experiences in India, is that there really aren't any Marxists or any progressives or anybody else really dealing with this question, with this fundamental reality that you might have people say, yeah, wage differentiation exists, but their argument is that, well, we want to climb up and not have that wage differentiation anymore, and fundamentally that just isn't possible, and that's kind of the issue. I think that in almost the entirety of the semi-periphery, to my understanding, everyone's imaginations are that we want to become rich. We will be rich one day, and yeah, that isn't possible. No matter what you do, no matter what happens, you can have a section of your population be rich, and I think India is an excellent example because since 1991. The section of India that has benefited from global capitalism is quite rich. I mean, they are. I mean, if you live in the West, you probably know a lot of Indians who are from India and are as rich as anybody else, because you can that section just earns wages that are essentially no different from the core. But that is the reality, that as a nation, that just isn't possible.
The last little thing that I was wondering, I guess this is the whole thing of the importance of the core process and why is it important. And with the semiconductors, we always hear about the military importance of them. And I guess intuitively, as someone who hasn't really read that much about it, I get this idea that, if you have the top semiconductors, this means that when there's going to be a world war in Silicon Valley, they'll just press this button and all of the, Russian and Chinese fighter jets, they'll just sort of explode. Or like this thing funny, like they'll throw the person in the seat out of the cockpit, and it'll be like this big anyway. But
that's a very Hollywood conception of it.
My brain has been infected by the imperialist propaganda. I don't know what the correct like Soviet comedic moment would be, some kind of interesting idiom that sort of is said at this moment, but there's no jump gag, but they just make this sort of little line that everyone starts quoting for the next 500 years in Russia and Ukraine. But anyway, and it makes no sense unless you sort of lived there for, your whole life. You have that. But anyway, but right now, in the Russia-Ukraine war, you had this whole idea that, Russia will be cut out and they can't get these important chips, but they're using them from the washing machines and stuff, right? And they're bypassing the sanctions to get these. And these are semiconductors, right? If I'm not, these are just basic ones.
Yeah.
And they're doing fine. And generally, I mean, we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine war, at least, that the technology isn't the most important factor, really. I mean, obviously, it is an important factor, but having domestic industrial base is really important, and a bunch of other different stuff. So I'm wondering, to what extent is it really that important to have? I mean, obviously, it's better to have the best superconductor design applications and so on. But is it really so crucial as it's made out to be in terms of, I guess, this military use, for instance?
So I mean, it's absolutely true that, in any industry really, that the cutting edge is never necessary. Of course, I mean, almost the entirety of the world in every factor of consumption does not have any use for the cutting edge. The cutting edge, of course, is used in a very specific set of things. But in the case of semiconductors, the issue with semiconductors specifically, and why it's so uniquely important, even more than something like vehicles or any other the standard industry, is that fundamentally some part of the other of semiconductors, I mean, some section or the other of your life has a requirement of semiconductors. And I mean, you can get by with using really old things. I mean, you take the example of various countries. I mean, not just Russia now, but you look at countries like North Korea today. I mean, they're using a lot of old tech in way, and they're fine. Like, there's not really like North Koreans are devoid of a happy life. They're using really old cell phones. They're using older things. You take the example of India prior to liberalization. In India, there was only one type of vehicle, and I think vehicles are also a good example. A bunch of countries basically used one model of vehicle or a few model of vehicles for like 20, 30, 40 years because they just didn't have all the new fancy models that the Americans were driving. In India, that model of car is called an ambassador. It was the sole model you could purchase for 20, 30 years, for example. But the issue at hand really is that in capitalism, there's a requirement to innovate, to have the latest. And I think example of say, for example, 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi technology, you have these kind of things that are, I mean, in some sense, super important to, national economies in a broad sense. I mean, in India, for example, the onset of 4G as a technology that was available in India basically meant that India went from about, 80 million people who had internet access to, of nearly 1 billion people now. I think like it's over 1 billion maybe. I'm not sure about the numbers, and this is in the last decade. Is not a thing from long back, and there's no denial that, I mean, people were living fine. It's not like that internet has solved people's issues or any of that stuff. But of course, it's an important thing that everyone needs to consume in one way or the other, and that even the cutting edge things are becoming, the cutting edge is becoming more important in the sense of you have, AI automation, you have all these machine learning and these like up and coming industries that, people are convinced are super important in terms of the future of industry and manufacturing. And, in one way or the other, from the very lowest end to the higher end, I mean, semiconductors specifically, the reason why, it's so in the limelight and always discussed in the media and all of these things is because at the end of the day, it is an industry that plays into a lot of things. I mean, in my opinion, it is at least, if not more important than, petrol or steel or, things that are fundamental to a nation or to any nation being able to have access to the basics of life. I mean, at this point, even in much of the third world and semi-peripheries and so on, a phone of some sort is considered a requirement. Like, you do need to have a phone, which wasn't a thing, some decades ago, of course. But yeah, I mean, there's no denying that it is very important. Of course, you can live without it, and I mean, ideally, in a future world, a lot of the things that we feel required in society would not be required. I mean, that is kind of the excess of capitalism. But as a technology in today's world, I mean, no country would be happy to be without it. I mean, that's fundamentally it. You do require it.
That's fair. And I guess, in terms of historic world wars, it's not been, I guess, it's always, these economic factors are obviously a huge factor and often a deciding factor. And it's not just the simple binary thing of having it or not having it, but it's also how much of it you have, and so on and so on, and your ability to access it as well geographically, and so on. So anyway, it's a very interesting question. Joseph, you probably have to head off now, right?
I do, but this was a really excellent discussion that I loved. I really have been looking for something like this on the semiconductors because I've been trying to understand them better. So this article was really amazing to get to read and understand the industry. I feel like I have a better grasp over it. I'd love to follow up. Maybe we can do more discussions because I think we're also, like I mentioned, the Emmanuel Association. We're definitely looking for people who have this knowledge and are willing to like talk about it more, popularize this information, whether through writing or through more podcasts. So we should definitely follow up and continue discussions. We can talk about something of your choice.
I mean, my long-term vision, at least, is, I mean, Emmanuel Wallerstein. None of them have surprisingly enough, for whatever reason, have never really gained an audience in India. Which is, I mean, I know in Latin America, for example, they're hugely popular. But in India, especially, they're like, I mean, really unknown. Nobody really knows them, and neither in economics or in sociology or anything really. So, I mean, it is an imagined goal of mine to kind of at least begin some kind of literature and discourse and analysis, at least of India and of, I mean, various things from these perspectives. Because, I mean, I have a work coming up that discusses this in more depth. But yeah, I mean, it's a big issue here because even the questions of wage differentiation, forget even internationally, even within a country, what that really means. And these kind of things are not really talked about. There's this, I mean, from the Marxist lens, it's a very orthodox position of, just that workers the world unite and this focus on industrial workers, which in India, for example, makes up like a percentage of the population, like the formal, non-contractual permanent industrial workers have always been the focus of Marxist organization. So, there is a weakness in terms of dealing with the reality of capitalism in various ways, I think, especially in India. So, we can have a chat. I would love to help with any furthering of the Emmanuel agenda.
Fantastic. Great. Well, yeah, let's stay in touch. I'll also send an email after this with like an invitation to that group. And let's keep our Discord chat and just keep discussing this stuff.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Take care and sleep well, Peter. See you next time.
I will. Yeah, see you guys.
Bye. Bye.